Hello and welcome to this video on supply side policies. So previously we looked at monetary policy and fiscal policy, which we would call demand side policies because they try to influence AD. But supply side policies are nothing to do with AD, they are to do with aggregate supply. So these are policies that try and increase the level of aggregate supply within the economy. So in this video we're going to look at what is meant by supply side policies, some definitions. Then there are two broad categories of supply side policy that we need to be aware of, and that is market-based policies and interventionist policies. And then we're going to finally look at some ideas to evaluate these policies. So let's start off with some definitions. A supply side policy includes any action by the government intended to increase the productive potential of the economy. In effect, what we're trying to do is increase the level of aggregate supply within the economy. And in our ADAS diagram, this would be shifting the AS curve to the right. This can be done by improving the productivity, availability, or quality of resources, reducing costs to businesses, or providing incentives for business to increase their willingness to produce. So supply side policy will shift AS to the right, and we can see that effective supply side policies increase national income, and a real bonus that you should make sure you get down in your notes is they also lower the rate of inflation. So many supply side policies are concerned with improving the factors of production. So increasing the quantity or the quality of the inputs will enable the economy to be in a position to potentially produce more. So improving the natural resources or the quality or the ability to extract natural resources, training the workforce or having a larger workforce, improving the technology available to businesses or improving the finance available to businesses, and creating incentives for entrepreneurs to increase the scale of production would all be classified as supply side policies. And this is the diagram that we need to have in our notes to illustrate a supply side policy. Supply side policy shifts AS to the right. The impact of this is an increase in GDP, an increase in national income from Y to Y1. And again, make sure you have this in your notes, a reduction in the price level. So this is anti-inflationary economic growth, which is very desirable from an economy's point of view. So we looked at what is meant by supply side policies. We're going to now distinguish between the market-based ones and the interventionist ones. Market-based supply side policies focus on the power of the free market. They allow the powers of supply and demand to adjust the prices of factors of production. So these policies are where the government try and promote the market mechanism. They don't actively try and do stuff themselves. They try and create a better environment for the market to encourage production to increase. So these market-based policies would all go alongside the classical theory, which, if you remember from earlier in the term, was all about minimizing government intervention and allowing markets to work freely. And as such, our demand and supply ADAS diagram that would illustrate this for a classical based market-based policy would involve the vertical long run aggregate supply curve, which a supply side policy would cause that to shift to the right. So if to try and to illustrate a classical supply side policy, we would use this diagram. Let's have a look at some examples. If we start off with the labour market, these would be market-based supply side policies. So anything that's trying to reduce labour costs to firms and improve the flexibility of the workforce. So, for example, reducing welfare payments to members of society would potentially encourage them to enter the workforce because they can earn more in the workforce than they would do on welfare payments. This would increase the supply of labour, maybe bringing down wage costs and giving firms a greater access to workers. Reducing the national minimum wage, again, would be a market-based supply side policy. This would lower costs to businesses, encouraging them to increase production. Opening up immigration would allow firms to attract a wider pool of skilled workforce, and also the increase in the supply of labour would again bring down wage costs, which would encourage firms to increase production. And the last one is to reduce trade union power. Trade unions often are involved in collective bargaining, where they demand a certain level of wages for their members. Reducing the trade union power should have an impact of reducing wages in the marketplace and again lowering costs to businesses, encouraging them to increase their scale of production. There are also some market-based policies to do with tax and investment. Reducing income tax would again lower potentially the costs to business and encourage an increased scale of production. Likewise, reducing corporation tax would enable businesses to generate more profits, which they could then invest and expand and produce more. Providing a reduced tax for certain industries would give an incentive to produce more. For example, in the UK, the film industry receive tax breaks from the government. And lastly, we have some market-based supply-side policies that are related to business. Privatizing businesses or deregulating businesses, removing the rules and restrictions as to what they can do, would potentially encourage them to produce more. Again, privatization, allowing private individuals to own businesses and pursue profits, would create an incentive for them to increase the scale of production. Removing tariffs, again, would be an example, lowering costs to businesses. And ensuring that if businesses do come up with good ideas, then those ideas are protected, because then we'll create an incentive for them to produce new ideas and produce more. Interventionist policies, on the other hand, involve the government actually taking a more active approach and intervening in order to try and provide an environment where businesses produce more. This is an active role for government, direct interventions or interfering with the market mechanism rather than allowing the market mechanism to more freely function. So this would be more consistent with the Keynesian theory of economics, or this would be considered a more Keynesian approach. And as such, this would be the diagram we would use to illustrate a long-run aggregate supply curve under the Keynesian philosophy or the Keynesian model of how the economy works. So again, we can split them into our three categories. In terms of the labour market, these would be more interventionist approaches that would encourage firms to produce more. Providing education and training to the workforce would enable firms to have a more skilled workforce, which could increase the scale of production. Providing more vocational training, for example, apprenticeships in particular careers, would again provide the businesses with a more skilled workforce, incentivizing them to increase production. Improving housing affordability would allow workers to move around the country, so they can go to areas where there is high employment and provide workers in those areas, businesses in those areas with extra workers, enabling them to increase production. Similarly, subsidizing worker relocation, so giving workers money to relocate to particular areas where there is demand for workers, would again help the businesses in those areas and enable them to increase the scale of production. Improving information about job vacancies, so workers are more aware of where there are jobs and they can move to the jobs. The firms in those areas would benefit and again increase production. Investing in healthcare to provide a healthier workforce may reduce sick leave and absenteeism, which again would help businesses to produce more. In terms of investment, governments can improve transport links and infrastructure. Businesses can then take advantage of these improved transport links and infrastructure to increase their scale of production. Examples would be ports, roads, trains. Similarly, things like broadband and online security would enable businesses to thrive and enable them to produce more. Under the category of business, governments could try and encourage more competition through trying to avoid the situation where there are monopolies within markets. Governments may provide businesses with subsidies to try and encourage them to increase their scale of production as well. So some examples of supply-side policies. High-speed rail 2 would be an example of an interventionist infrastructure policy. So with the Thames Gateway, a large-scale port in southeast of England, and also Crossrail, which is currently being built connecting west to east in the southeast. This would be interventionist infrastructure projects. Businesses could take advantage of this, and the potential output of the economy could grow. AS would shift to the right. Some other examples here. In the last couple of years, there have been an attempt by the government to reduce the power of trade unions so they can have less bargaining power over wages, there'll be less strike action, and therefore a cheaper and more regularly attending workforce, which would help businesses. In the last year, and a current government pledge is to cut corporation tax. This would be an example of a market-based tax and investment supply-side policy, which allows firms to keep more profits, which they can reinvest in expanding their scale of production. Over recent years, governments have made pledges to increase the number of apprenticeships and vocational training, providing businesses with a more skilled workforce potentially, which would be a supply-side policy. Also, cutting welfare may encourage people to re-enter the workforce and seek employment, which should be beneficial in terms of increasing the supply of labour, the amount of labour, and also reducing wage rates, which could both help the economy to produce more. So we looked at some market-based and interventionist supply-side policies and some examples. Now let's look at some evaluations. In terms of evaluating the market-based policies, in terms of the labour market-based policy, whilst it might be desirable from a business's perspective, from a worker's perspective, labour market flexibility may not necessarily be desirable. It might encourage more competition for your job, which may cause more stress. Also, if there are more potential workers and wages go down, this would result in a lower income. In terms of tax and investment, taking away unemployment benefits may encourage people into work, but care must be taken to protect the vulnerable, and here we're thinking about things like disability allowance and those who are really not able to work. Again, removing these payments, welfare payments, may be more of an aggressive approach, worsening the equality of income, so not really affecting the rich, but disadvantaging the poor. In terms of investing and offering tax breaks to businesses, an evaluation point here might be, well, how does the government know which businesses are deserving of those tax breaks and which businesses are the productive ones, productive investments who would benefit from a tax break, and which are the unproductive ones. In terms of business, market-based policy might be deregulation, but this can create instability. For example, a lot of financial deregulation was credited with causing the credit crunch, the financial crisis in 2008. In terms of evaluation of interventionist policies, in terms of the labour market, there is an opportunity cost of spending on education and training. And also, if we're spending money on education and training, do we know exactly what sort of skills we should be teaching and training students to have when they won't actually be needed in the workplace for a number of years' time? In terms of investment, there's an opportunity cost of large-scale infrastructure investments. What could that money have been done otherwise, used otherwise for? And also there's the risk of overspend. In many recent infrastructure projects in the UK, the initial price that's quoted has not been the final price of the project. There has been budget overspend, and that increases the cost to the government, who already have very large national debt. Often these investment projects, infrastructure projects, take a long time to complete, and so they take longer to work and have an effect on the economy than perhaps many demand-side policies. In terms of the interventionist approach to businesses, well, if we're subsidising businesses, again, there's an opportunity cost to that. And again, how do we know which industries to back? Which are the ones that should receive subsidies? Which are the ones that shouldn't? So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by supply-side policies. We looked at two broad categories, market-based and interventionist, and within those, some policies that governments might look at. We've also looked at some examples, and then we just finished off with some evaluation points. So maybe worth going back through the video and making sure you've got definitions, you've got advantages, you've got disadvantages, all the different categories, and a few examples plus diagrams. And if you're happy with that, then you finish. Thank you very much. Bye.